know why? Because at the end of the day, believing that there's a God is something that almost all people do deep down inside, right? So the fact that you have to convince someone that there's a God usually makes it very challenging to speak with that type of person about anything. Because if God needs to be proven, then it's going to be hard to prove anything else. Some people have some like basic confusions, like how come there's a God, but there's like evil in the world, or how come there's a God? Okay, but in general, if you're going to like master the logical arguments, it probably, if you're going to need to use all of that firepower with someone just to get them to God exists, it could mean that they're not being logical to begin with. It could be that they are coming with a mindset that is all about doubting anything and everything, right? The psychology of doubt, the psychology of being too skeptical, radically, extremely skeptical, meaning suspicious, meaning second-guessing everything. And so it's not necessarily a problem with what you're calling to, it's a problem with the person not being able to, you know, actually value what you're telling them, what you're sharing with them, what you're calling them to. And even when it comes to women's rights in Islam, those are extremely important, and on some level, they may strike a chord within a person, right? That, yeah, you know, this seems to be a nice religion that treats people nice and treats not just men nice, but women nice as well. But niceness also is not a very clear concept, right? Like, a really long time ago, it was believed to be nice if you're good to your parents, you serve your parents. Nowadays, it's just weird. Like, why are you holding yourself back from life, trying to be nice to your parents? Forget your parents. What about you, right? Your future. You know, the concept of just like, out with the old, in with the new. Being nice to your parents isn't as easily appreciated. Or let me flip it. A long time ago, it wasn't seen at all, you know, as nice to be greedy. The whole world agreed that being greedy is a bad thing, right? But nowadays, we celebrate greedy people. Right? Like people that are just after the next dollar, after the next win, after the next big bang. And instead of like taking even our wisdom in life from prophets or philosophers or thinkers or otherwise, we want to hear like what the Tesla guy had to say, right? We want to hear what, you know, this big tycoon in the business industry had to say. And I just use all of that as an example as the concept of nice. Being nice is actually very unclear. It's fluid, right? And so that is why trying to prove that God exists or trying to prove that Islam has been nice to women, right, has its value, but if you overestimate it, it's not going to get you very far. You may not actually get, okay, Islam is nice to women, so what? Doesn't mean it's true, doesn't mean it's from God, doesn't mean I have to like sacrifice all these things in my life to start living like a Muslim, right? And so convincing someone logically that God exists will not get you very far a lot of times. And convincing people that Islam is nice doesn't prove that Islam is special or divine or from God. And so these are good things to have. They can be conversation starters. But what you really want to get to is Islam itself. What is Islam? Where does it come from? How can we prove it comes from God? That is a far better conversation. And there is nothing better towards that conversation than discussing the Quran. Why? What does that say? The miracle of all miracles. Because the Quran is the clearest miracle. It really is the clearest miracle. There's a hadith, a beautiful hadith you should remember in your da'wah, that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, ما من نبي إلا وأوتي ما على مثله آمن الناس وكان الذي أوتيته وحيا فأرجو أن أكون أكثرهم تبعا يوم القيامة. It says that there was never a prophet Allah sent to guide people, to call people, except that he was given some signs which would help his people believe in him. This is actually from God. That's the whole point, right? Not this is a nice religion, it's actually from God. He said, what I was especially given was this book, this wahi, this special revelation. And because of this book, not because of any other reason, not because it proves rationally that God exists, not because of niceness to women or otherwise, right? Because of this book, I am hopeful that I will have the most followers on the Day of Judgment. I will be able to save the most amount of people on the Day of Judgment because of this book. And so what that hadith means is that you need to be sure that the Quran is extra effective, extra special at bringing people to the fold, at bringing people to Islam. Is that clear? The hadith, by the way, doesn't mean that other prophets had other miracles and I was given a book. Because other prophets had books too, right? And also he was given other miracles that weren't a book. You get it? So there's an overlap. They received books and had other miracles. He received the book and he had other miracles, moon splitting and otherwise. But this one book is really special. It is the miracle of all miracles. That's the point of the hadith. Any questions on this point? Don't be naive, don't be silly, don't think that you're just going to say the miracle is all miracle, people are just going to believe you. This one is really, really special. Because, think about it, like imagine you were trying to think like a non-Muslim. We just got to be honest, right? It's really hard to imagine how a book can be a miracle. It doesn't sort of like, how can any work of literature, any book, be a miracle? You got a lot of work to do. And you probably don't just want to like give someone a 2, 3, 4 hour lecture, right? And so the point of the rest of the discussion today, our next 40 minutes or so together, is to give you angles for you to explain this, and you should be crafty. You should be sensitive to what may work with this person, what may work with that person. Alright? Don't sit there and say, okay, what was that first point you now said again? Hear me out, right? And you rattle it off. That's just bad strategy, and the person probably has shut off. And there are people that do this all the time, by the way. Like when they get into a conversation with a non-Muslim, it's just like a cookie cutter approach. Like this is how we're gonna do it, no matter who's in front of me, no. It's like medicine. Medicine, when doctors are trying to apply medicine, they just don't have a list of medicines. The first thing they do is they try to understand the patient in front of them, right? I'm not trying to say the whole world is sick and diseased. But the idea is you want to be sensitive that you don't trigger a person. What if they have a certain allergy to a certain concept, right? What if they can't appreciate it? You have to understand these things. I remember, I'll give you one of the craziest examples I ever had. One time I was in college speaking about women's rights in Islam, ironically. And there's this sister in the crowd. I used to speak to her weekly. She used to work in the computer lab, older woman. She was actually a Christian missionary, actually. She used to she studied well. She used to have these long conversations with us on downtime about why Islam is wrong. But basically, she gets up in the middle of my talk, and she attends all my talks. She gets up and she storms out. She walks out. And I was like, I'll ask her later. It was obvious she was upset. And after that, she said, I appreciate everything you said, but it just makes no sense whatsoever that, you say that the Prophet said, your mother, then your father. There's a hadith, the Prophet said that, right? And I'm like, wow, it's crazy. I'd never expect to hear that, especially from a woman, right? And it turned out she just had a really rough relationship with her mom, the sister. So she couldn't wrap her head around this hadith. This hadith, by the way, is like an all-time favorite for almost anybody. Anyone hears this, oh, it's so beautiful, such a beautiful concept. Your mom did, carry you and deliver you and nurse you. 3 things your dad never did. So it makes sense to at least give her 3 times the right to being reminded about than the dad. It just fits. You don't even need to explain it. It just, emotionally it fits. Yeah, mom deserves this. But for this particular patient, right, it just is unacceptable, right? And so you just gotta be able and versatile, flexible enough to explain your case in different ways. That's very important in Dawah. Any questions on this? So here are some of these ways. Well, let me ask you first, before I unveil my toolkit. How is the Quran a miracle? Adam.
Because it's the only known, because that is the true word of Allah. Since it's the true word of Allah is basically a miracle.
How?
Because it already shows all the miracles that's happening inside it. It tells us the miracles that have happened.
Okay, anyone else? How is the Quran a miracle? The dimension, the different ways you can try to explain the Quran as a miracle. In what ways?
One would be that you cannot find a fault in it, like any other book. Quran is faultless, you know, and it has some predictions that really happened, and you know, and people have been trying to, you know, replicate it or you know find fault. They haven't been able to do that, and it is there's no other book like that.
Okay.
I know of.
Very good. Jazakallah khair. Anyone else? Musab.
And Allah said, Alif Lam Mim, Dhalika Kitab la Rayba Fih, like there's no any other books that said this book has no any faults, like any mistakes except the Quran.
Okay.
Science.
Science.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did challenge.
I'm not agreeing or disagreeing, by the way. I'm acknowledging. Yes.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did challenge that anyone to bring just an ayah or two like Quran.
Yeah.
So in that itself, it is saying that it's a miracle, it's unique, it cannot be. Yeah.
Okay.
There couldn't be a comparable to.
One more. Someone who hasn't spoken. Nisi, you want to speak? Go for
I
it.
was gonna say it's, I mean, there's a lot of different things, but I would say mostly it's unchanged. It's like the only thing.
Preservation. Of the Quran.
Preservation.
How does that prove that it's a miracle?
I mean, we can get really philosophical about it, but I think mostly it's if you look over the last 1,400 years, anytime that someone has attempted to change it, even by a vow, you have hundreds of thousands of people coming out saying no. Like I listened to someone say, I was reciting one day and I mentioned one thing wrong. My grandfather said, say it again. He said it wrong again. He's like, look at what you're reading. And he goes, that's just my grandfather, but you've got hundreds of thousands of people that are coming out and saying you cannot change this. So I think the preservation of it is one way of showing it's a miracle of miracles.
Awesome.
One aspect.
Right. Very good. So I'm going to try to bucket the miracles that we discussed today into 4 dimensions. That's not to say there are only 4, but just for the sake of keeping it brief, and for the sake of also hopefully we have a lively conversation, inshallah, back and forth, because I'm tired of hearing myself speak. Okay, bang. Where's my picture? No picture. No picture. Okay, fine. No picture. I remember there being a picture there. So, first and foremost, the Quran was recognized as something super special in terms of its language. And I think, I didn't always used to do this, but I think it's important for us when we try to say the Quran is a linguistic miracle, there's nothing like the language of the Quran, not just to realize the people we're speaking to, because they're not traditional Arabs, will not be able to really appreciate this firsthand, they're going to take it on trust. I think we need to recognize that we ourselves are not traditional Arabs, and we're not going to be able to really explain this in a way because we haven't experienced it firsthand either, right? Like, we say there's absolutely nothing like the Quran in terms of its language. It's an absolute masterpiece in terms of its language, nothing like it. Say, okay, you know, the Arabs were the masters of language, they were on the planet, and their poetry was unparalleled, and the Quran totally dominated their poetry. But if I were to take out for you some like old, archaic Arabic poetry, and take out for you a verse from the Quran and say, okay, can you explain that to me? How is this superior to this? We would all be dead in the water, right? Myself included, by the way. I'm not a linguist. Okay, and so I still think we can make this point. We can make this point without having that skill set, without being able to actually explain to people how the Quran, in its composition, in the structure of its language, is so superior. And there's so many ways to do this, right? Way number 1 is just to notice the reaction of the Quran's first audience. This is very, very, very important. So, you know, as one of the scholars said, the fact that the contemporaries, meaning the people living around the Prophet ﷺ, when they wanted to reject his message because like he wasn't from their tribe or whatever other reasons, right? They tried everything except to simply meet the challenge of the Quran to produce a book like it. Like there's a challenge in the Quran that says, if you are in any doubt that this is from God, فَأْتُوا بِعَشْرِ سُورَةٍ أو فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ. Bring about 1 chapter like it. The shortest chapter in the Quran is like 2 lines, right? Bring about 1 chapter like it, and you go call your own witnesses to testify that you're right. It's a superior production. Like it's like 1 chapter, right? 2 lines. this Quran is thousands of verses, right? Just give me 2 lines, and you go call your own supporters, your own biased judges, to agree with you, right? And they never did that. They did everything but that. They threatened the Prophet Muhammad, they persecuted his followers, they killed their own family members, they waged war against like the campaign, the Islamic message, and they did all of that, but they never just brought, like, you'd think if it was easy enough, you just do it. They call it the low-hanging fruit, right? Just, you guys get your master poets together to produce something, to just embarrass Muhammad and say that he's just, making stuff up, that his book is so great. And so that's one of, the early scholars, his name was Al-Baqillani, rahimahullah. Al-Baqillani said, the fact that they reached for their swords meant that they were failed by their words. That's the idea. Like, why would you reach for your swords and start wars and lose your chiefs and go through all this, spend so much money, do all this? You could have just produced another book like it. It's that simple. Why go for the harder option? Okay? Another way to appreciate this is the fact that they themselves admitted behind closed doors that the Quran has something unique about it. There's like a certain charm to the Quran, a certain power to the language of the Quran. You'll never see anything like it. That's the second way to do it. A third way to do it is to tell you that these, traditional Arabs, many of them retired from poetry and they said, after the Quran has come down, I refuse to put together any more poetry. And this is, I think, part of understanding how they can do that. Being a master poet was like the tier 1, rank in early Arabian society. Like, people would only congratulate you on 2 things, really. When you had a newborn, or when a poet rose in your tribe. Those are basically the 2 festivals for early Arabia. The Arabs used to call, I'm not saying this is right, it's pre-Islam, they used to call non-Arabs ajam. Ajam, we translate it as non-Arabs. But ajam literally means speechless. Like, inanimate objects are called ajmawat. Like a rock is a ajam. So they're basically saying these people, all these other people in the world, the nations, Rome and Persia and all the other countries, they're all subhuman basically, because they don't know how to speak the way we speak, and animals don't know how to communicate. We're the only people on planet Earth that know how to communicate, right? Pre-Islam. So this is how the degree of mastery and skill they have in the Arabic language is what made them now have their master poets at the highest echelon of society, the highest rank in society. Those master poets, of them retired from poetry, of them became Muslim. Everyone else waged war against Muhammad. So something was odd here. And one last part here, to appreciate how the Quran is a linguistic miracle, when they were trying to figure out ways to campaign against Muhammad, do you know what they settled on? And this is also, once again, undisputed historically. You know what they called him? They called him anything. They called him crazy, they called him, selfish, greedy, trying to become, the king among us. They never had a king, right? What they settled in the end is that, our best bet is to align on the allegation that he's a magician, he's a sorcerer. So they started telling everyone, he's a sorcerer. If you just listen to Muhammad, he's gonna he's gonna brainwash you. If you just listen to him, he's gonna put you under a spell. So don't even give him ear. They didn't realize that when they called him a sorcerer, they were admitting what? He's beyond human, right? And he is human. I'm saying that his Quran is supernatural. You understand? Why would you say sorcerer? And so this is of the ways to argue the fact that they themselves all agreed that what he brought, this Quran, was beyond human capacity. That's 4 or 5 points. There's a 6th point that's here, that I think is so much easier for us to appreciate how the Quran in its language is a miracle. Because the reference point is far closer to home. Some scholars, non-Muslim scholars on Islam, Orientalists they are called, some of them, I believe this was Arthur J. Arbery, he's a non-Muslim scholar, or Orientalist scholar, who actually knows Arabic pretty well. He actually has his own translation of the Quran you can buy in the markets. He's not Muslim. But he tried to make the claim. Sorry, I'm going to stand now. Because I can't turn around 10 times on one slide. Yeah. So he tried to make the claim that, yeah, sure, the Quran is absolutely unique in its language, but that doesn't mean it's supernatural. You get it? Like, okay, fine, Quran is top-notch, best thing ever written or produced in Arabic. That doesn't mean it's a miracle. We're just going a little too far here, we're exaggerating, you Muslims get carried away. That's basically what he's arguing. So, he says that every language has its supreme literature. You have Shakespeare in English, you have, what do you have in Greek? What's the trophy piece in Greek?
Is it Plato or Aristotle?
The Iliad of Homer, right? That's like the number one in Greek. The sonnets of Shakespeare are number one in English. He's saying this. And so the Arabic's no different. Like, yeah, we all agree, Muslim and non-Muslim, that the Arabic of the Quran is a masterpiece, nothing like it. And that's true, by the way. No one disagrees on this. They only disagree on whether it's from God or not. That's the only part of the conversation we're having right now. Is it justified to say it's from God? And so he says, no, it's not justified. It's like, Shakespeare stuff. It's real special, impressive, league of its own. Let's put it down, that's it. But that is really, 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 like, interesting. Fascinating that he says that, because he's overlooking a whole bunch of differences between the Quran and between the works of Shakespeare. So one of them is, oh, there's a pointer. I've never used one of these before. Okay, focus, Mohammad. Who had access to education, books, and libraries? The Prophet ﷺ or Shakespeare? Only Shakespeare. The Prophet ﷺ was not school taught. Shakespeare was school taught English, school taught Latin. The Prophet ﷺ was from society that was largely illiterate. And that is why spoken poetry, long story, evolved in such an impressive way. Part of it was their dependence on spoken word. Like their honor, their history, their life, all of that. Anyway, who had access to books? Illiterate society versus Shakespeare had access to libraries at a time. Libraries at his disposal. So that's one huge difference, right? You can imagine the Prophet ﷺ never uttered a couplet, a full sentence of poetry in his entire life, and then he crushes all of the master poets overnight at the end of his life. Something doesn't add up here. Who wrote for a living? Definitely wasn't the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Shakespeare used to get paid to write his plays. He was a professional playwright that had the luxury of spending 8 to 10 to 12 to 15 hours a day and improving his craft with every new play he writes, right? Every new production. Make sense? The Prophet ﷺ was a trader and a shepherd, and that's it. Off in the remote desert somewhere. Completely different experience and career path. Who brought about a complete different use of the language? The composition of the language and its structure was completely different. Not Shakespeare. You think Shakespeare invented sonnets? You guys know what sonnets are, right? What are sonnets?
5 repeated verse poetry with rhyme at the
You gotta let me embarrass people first before you actually say it.
Can you define for us?
Yeah, so in the interest of time, sonnets are a form of poetry in English. Poetry has forms. There's, whatever, the haiku and otherwise, right? So sonnets have existed. This way of writing poetry, this measure of writing poetry, 5 lines, 3 lines, and otherwise, these things existed hundreds of years before Shakespeare. Shakespeare just mastered it. He was really good at it. That's all. With the Prophet ﷺ, he used Arabic in a way that was not Arabic, because they know what Arabic looks like. They know the structures of the language, highly sophisticated for them. They spoke better than anyone else on the planet. He steps away from their structure, doesn't follow any of the 16, for example, structures of Arabic poetry, but yet what he's saying is crystal clear. And that's where it became a paradox for them. Like, this is perfectly Arabic. We understand perfectly what you're trying to say, but it's absolutely not Arabic because it doesn't meet any of the structures. You understand? Imagine someone trying to speak to you in English, jumbling up the 9 parts of a sentence, right? So he steps away from all forms of structure in Arabic, yet his words are the most eloquent Arabic ever heard by people. And you're saying this is illogical. How can it be Arabic and not Arabic at the same time? That's why it's a miracle. A miracle that is logical is no longer a miracle, right? And then the stylometric test. This is just a nice big fancy word. Stylometric test is actually a statistical study that people invented nowadays with computers to basically, they call it author discrimination. How can you basically measure down to numbers how people speak, their style of speaking, to figure out whether this person actually said those words or not. So for instance, if you're able to, and this is how, like if we today were able to pull out from under the ground here a manuscript that says Shakespeare's Long Lost Sonnet, a brand new play that we never heard of before, they would actually go and take it through a stylometric test based on what we already know about Shakespeare's style, and through math tell you that this doesn't match up with Shakespeare's patterns, Shakespeare's styles, right? That's actually how, through stylometry, they say that certain parts of the Bible that are attributed to Paul, for example, are actually no way written by Paul. That's one of the ways they argue this. And so they actually perform 12 experiments that compare the Quran with the everyday words of the Prophet Muhammad, which we have. We have the hadith, right? And so when they compare these two, they tell you, for example, 2% of the words in the Quran don't exist in the hadith, in the everyday conversations of Muhammad, right? And like that. So with these sorts of tests, they wind up saying, wait a minute, it is absolutely impossible for someone to police their vocabulary in that way. Like, I use this half of my vocabulary for these conversations, and only this half of my vocabulary for those conversations. That's humanly impossible. You can't do that. Especially over the span of 23 years. You just can't. Humans are not that capable. And by the way, this thing is just like a cool scientific way that they measured it now. The people around the Prophet Muhammad, they knew this. They didn't say, you speak like that every day anyway. They knew that at 40 years old, or 43 years old, when he went public with the message, that even you don't speak like that. No one speaks like that. So they didn't actually need all of this. But this is like for your own first-hand appreciation of the style. The style of the Quran was too different when tested, even from the style in which Muhammad spoke. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Couldn't have been the same author. And then, unwavering eloquence. Shakespeare is not always at the same level of impressiveness. All human beings have these, just like lecturing nowadays, right? They find a sentence that just came out really well, and they take it as a snippet and turn it into a short, or turn it into a nugget or something. They call them gems or whatever it is. All humans are like this. You have like these just moments of brilliance that just, you were inspired. Just you framed it in such a nice way. Shakespeare is the same exact thing, because Shakespeare is human. So there are parts of Shakespeare that all English professors love to just dwell on. Wow. Look how he knocked that one out the park, right? With the Quran, there's none of this. Because the Arabs like poetry so much, they had this really, really brutal literary critique tradition. What that means is that they have this thing where for fun, they would poke holes at each other's language. Like, that poem, that was hot and everything, but this, because of that, should have been this. All they do is poke holes at each other's language, right? No one has ever been reported to pick out a segment of the Quran that could be bettered in any way. That line could have been this, or could have been that, could have been shorter, could have been more brief, more concise, more succinct, more eloquent. So there's no wavering eloquence. There's no this, segments of brilliance in the Quran, the same way there isn't in human writing. Challenged his peers. Did Shakespeare ever tell the world, I dare you to produce anything like my poems? No. Is Shakespeare the undisputed number one? No. Matter of fact, Sorry, they dragged me through English literature. My first bachelor's in English literature. There is no agreement on Shakespeare being number one in English. You know, Hugh Craig from Newcastle University is a famous professor that wrote in his book on the fact that there are 7 famous playwrights in English. He actually counts Shakespeare as number 7. He put 6 people in front of him. But Shakespeare just had really good like social position, right? He was popular basically. Not everyone who's popular means he's the best scientist or poet or whatever else, right? And so Shakespeare is the most famous, but he knew, and everyone knew, that he was just like the most popular or the most award-winning in an arena of like worthy competitors, right? It was a contest. But with the Prophet ﷺ, he challenged them, chastised them, the Quran did, bring something like it. I challenge you, bring something, a fraction of it. And no one ever met the challenges. No one ever could. I'll be quick now because I already used my whole hour on this. The flexibility of fiction. Who wrote fiction, Muhammad or Shakespeare? Right? And when you're writing fiction, it's far easier to be more appealing. You know, the Quran is not just storytelling. Actually, the storytelling style in the Quran is not like what we're used to at all. Because it's very intentional about how and why and when it shares stories. No fillers, no complete story where you just get lost and stop reflecting. Very rare does the Quran do that. Shakespeare's taking you on a ride. It's really entertaining, right? It's a drama, there's conspiracy and scandal, this, that, and the third, and he gets to add whatever he wants because it's not reality. The Quran is talking about really uncomfortable topics. Whether they're philosophical, what does it mean to exist, who God is and isn't, who's going to be saved and who isn't, what hypocrisy deep within our hearts looks like, these are uncomfortable topics. The fact that these topics can be as, worded in a way that can keep people coming back for more and more and more and more. That brings us to the next point, universal appeal. Like if I were if I owned a university and I wanted to, host an event, a Shakespeare play, who's gonna come? Adam. Just you. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, upper to middle class, high school, probably more college educated, predominantly Caucasian, right? People. This is just like, that is the very tight niche where Shakespeare can be appreciated. Step outside the Muslim majority world even, right here in America, where we're a minority, a scattered minority, you put in Quran, an expert reciter competition going, a Quran night somewhere, where kids or adults are reciting the Quran. Who's going to come? Every sector of the community, right? The young and the old, the white and the black, the rich and the poor, the educated, everyone's going to come, right? How did the Quran pull that off? There's really no book like it. And then these two are my favorite, I think. This is a little close to fiction. Creative liberty, Shakespeare, it's not just about creative liberty. Shakespeare independently wrote his books. He wrote on whatever he wanted to write about, whether fiction or not. He wrote about what he wanted to write about. You get it? The Quran, imagine how hard it is for you to try to write anything that is responses to people talking to you and events happening to you where you can't control them, external factors. For example, there are 13 places in the Quran that start with يَسْأَلُونَكَ. They ask you about this, O Muhammad, tell them that. They ask you about this. Imagine when your audience gets to dictate what you write about. Your writing should be expected to be what? All over the place. Like I'm trying to talk about this here, and someone's coming asking me a question about that, right? How am I going to pull this off? Make sense? And yet the Quran not just responds to questions people are asking. The Quran is also coming down at times of like emotional distress. Like there are times when his family members, the Prophet Muhammad's family members, are being massacred. Do you think he's expected to be as eloquent when he gives people new Quran? These verses just came down, right? New Quran. At that time versus a time when things are calm and like I'm just sipping on some tea under a candlelight, being real eloquent right now. And There should be like a huge difference between this time when I'm under all this stress, but the Quran is just immune to all of this. You want to ask questions? Go ahead and ask questions. Muhammad himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is going through all this turbulence in his life. It's all right. The Quran is still going to have its unwavering eloquence. Very unexpected. It's beyond human. The last one, here's the kicker. Do you know of any human being that writes back to front? Not right to left. Or left to, no, back to front. Like imagine a book, the last line of the book, right? Then the second to last line of the book, then the third last line of the book. Not a book they memorize either. Like, I don't want to say from the hip, but you understand the challenge here. So Shakespeare, of course, didn't do that. Shakespeare knew from the beginning, probably, how his plays would play out, how they were beginning to end. What the Quran did, or how the Quran came down, people don't really realize this. The order that you have the Quran today was the final placement of the verses as confirmed by the Archangel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad. Now it's final, right? But over the course of 23 years, they were coming down, the word is interspersed. But basically like this. I want you to imagine this is a gorgeous tapestry, a work of art. Because the Quran is a work of art, right? It's a gorgeous, image. Fully coherent, so eloquent, so beautiful, so salient, has such appeal. But it was put together like this. Kind of like those Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy things, but not words, right? Can you imagine this? Can you imagine hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of Quran put together like this? Would you expect it to be this beautiful, seamless tapestry? No way in the world, right? So you get why Arbery was wrong by trying to compare the Quran to Shakespeare? This is not possible for any human. Any one of these would have crossed out, right? Imagine when you add these 10 factors together. That is why people realize something is different about this book. Any questions about this? Yes, Jadure.
So, the order in which the surahs exist today in the Quran, is it the order in which they were revealed?
Correct.
So, assembled in linear fashion, how does that gel with it? Because the current day existing Quran is in a different order to what it was revealed. So, that means the assembling wasn't in a linear fashion.
Right. That's what I mean. I mean that who assembled their book in a linear fashion? Shakespeare, not Muhammad. Right? Any other questions? Let's do it. Moving on from language altogether. The Quran came down with so much knowledge about the lost past that leaves no explanation for those who delve into this topic, except that God was communicating with Muhammad. This is a source in God. The origin of this book is God. And there are different ways to appreciate this subject, right? One of them is to simply compare, simply learn how the original audience reacted to the knowledge of the lost past. How they reacted. You see, I'm going to share with you a few deep dives, very quick deep dives about, knowledge of the lost past the Quran spoke about and was only later discovered. But that is all extra. That is all unnecessary. That, yes, it may be more appreciated by people nowadays, but I want you to realize that this point doesn't require that. Like, doesn't require dig up fossils and archaeological excavation to pull out this artifact to realize, oh snap, the Quran was right. No. I'm just going to do that for fun. Okay? But well before this stuff, the excavations and the tombs and the digging up and all that, the people around Muhammad ﷺ would ask him questions about things they were sure he could not know about. Right? Because they're like, yeah, he speaks like Jews and Christians. He must have stole from them or something. So they would travel away and say, okay, let's go get some questions from them to prove him wrong. Right? Let's go stump Muhammad. And then they would come back with the questions like Dhul Qarnayn or the boys in the cave or other prophets and messengers from the past and otherwise, and they'd ask him, hey, if you're really a prophet, Tell us about this, that, and the third. And not only does he answer their questions and answer their trick questions, but also he tells them more than their reference points knew. So who are the boys in the cave? Boys, 7 boys who slept in a cave for 309 years. That's just the story, right? He gives them a whole explanation about exactly how the events unfolded with the boys in the cave. And so many of them, that's why many Jews in Medina, they felt like it was too difficult to continue arguing that Muhammad wasn't a prophet. So what they used to say to him is, okay, fine, you're a prophet, just not for us. You're a prophet for those illiterate people in Arabia. You're not one of the Israelites, so we don't have to listen to you. Fine, you're a prophet. Because they could not get around saying he wasn't a prophet when he's bringing all this knowledge of the lost past. And so all they could do, I mean, some of them became Muslim, but the some who didn't become Muslim didn't say you're not a prophet. They said, okay, you're a prophet for the other nations, the Goyams, right? The non-Israelite nations. So I just wanted to point that out, that the simple facts he stated to people around him made them sure that he was a prophet. But what are the 3 examples I want to give you very quickly about knowledge of the lost past? So I'll use 3 examples, or maybe 2 in the interest of time. Let's just try. Regarding ancient Egypt. So Muhammad in Arabia, very, very, very far away from Egypt. Even if he was in Egypt, nobody in Egypt knew this stuff. It was lost already at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. 1400 years ago, it was already lost for centuries. Basically what the ancient Egyptian civilizations looked like, who they were, nobody knew anything about this stuff. And so he spoke on it. The Quran spoke on Pharaoh of Moses, and Pharaoh drowned, and so on and so forth. Someone can say he got this stuff from the Jews and the Christians. Maybe he had like a secret helper whispering in his ear, telling him this stuff. Well, here's the problem. The story diverges between the Jewish-Christian narrative and the Quranic narrative in certain places. In one place, for example, it tells you that when Pharaoh drowned, God saved his body to be a lesson for tyrants forever, until the end of time, basically. That tidbit is not in the Bible, that the body will be preserved. The Quran mentions it. 1799, about 200 years ago, Napoleon invades Egypt and all that good stuff. They basically discover a tablet called the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone teaches them how to decipher, like translate hieroglyphics, ancient Egyptian language. It becomes a thing. It takes about 100 years, 150 years, becomes a thing, becomes a science. It's called Egyptology. Fast forward. They are very confident that either Merneptah or Ramses II was in fact the Pharaoh of Moses who died by way of drowning. Forensic studies have proven this, right? That those pharaohs, that Pharaoh died by drowning. You know, to say, appreciating this would take a long time, but to say that the body of the Pharaoh will be found is already a way to set up the Quran as delving into risky guesses. Because you know, most pharaohs, most mummies, their bodies are gone, right? So to say this particular mummy will be found, the body will be preserved, and that they drowned, right? Is splitting hairs here, and the Quran has no problem doing it, because the Quran is not guessing. That's one. Another example from ancient Egypt is that the Quran says when Pharaoh drowned, it says, and the skies never wept for him. The skies never wept for him. And this is just straightforward, like good riddance, basically, right? Everyone's reading this. That the skies were not saddened by his death. So, generally speaking, the believer is blessed wherever he is. And those defiant of God, like good riddance, basically, right? What's the word? No lost what? There's a word for it, guys. You guys speak English, right? No lost love, or whatever it's called. So the skies didn't love him. They're happy he's gone from planet Earth. They're happy he's not under them anymore. That's the face value, meaning still stands. through Egyptology, they discovered that these hieroglyphics used to basically write these like exaggerative adulations, this praise for the pharaohs, and say, when they died, the heavens wept, and so on and so forth. And so the Quran is saying, 2,000 years before we discover this stuff, no, they didn't. Right? Who else would have known that ancient Egyptians speak this way about their pharaohs when they die? You get the point here, right? The third example, very quickly on this point. I have 4 minutes left, unless you guys give me 10 more. The third point is, all throughout the Bible, the king of Egypt is called Pharaoh. You guys know that Pharaoh is not a name. Pharaoh is a title. It's like president or czar or, emperor. Pharaoh. It means the uppermost leader, the monarch, ruler of Egypt. I'll leave it translated like that for now. They call the king in the time of Abraham and Nimrud, they call him Pharaoh in the Bible. And the king in the time of his grandson Joseph, Prophet Joseph, is called the Pharaoh, right? And the king in the time of Moses is called the Pharaoh. That's fine. If the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was copying off of Judeo-Christian scriptures, he would have done the same thing, right? He would have said king of Egypt, Pharaoh, right? But the Quran is a little bit different here. The Quran uses the word Pharaoh 65 times and restricts its usage of the word Pharaoh to the story of Moses always. In the time of Abraham, in the time of Joseph, they are called kings, al-Malik, right? At best, they're called kings. Never once Pharaoh. Say, oh, coincidence. No, 65 times to 0 times, right? There's something glaring here. What is glaring? We discover recently that the term Pharaoh was reserved for the uppermost king of Egypt from Egypt because it meant elite house, elite bloodline, because they believed that he was the highest Egyptian, right? Half man, half God, right? This is what they believed. And so, if you don't believe me, like go to Encyclopedia Britannica and just look up when was the term Pharaoh coined. It was coined during the reign of Thutmose III, which is way after the reign of Abraham, the age of Abraham and Moses. I'm so sorry. Abraham, his son, was his son? Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Jacob had Joseph. Stop there. All those are well before the reign of Thutmose III, where the term Pharaoh was coined. Okay? There's something extra interesting here. It's also mentioned, historically established, that even if this term had existed a little earlier, from what Encyclopedia Britannica and everyone else already knows now, even if the term existed in the time of Joseph, it still would have been wrong to use it. Because during the time of Joseph, centuries before Moses, Egypt was not run by pharaohs. Egypt was invaded and occupied by an invading force from Palestine for 2 generations. So if you look at, for example, the chain of pharaohs, if you look it up in any history book, there's an interruption when there was no pharaohs. That's because the Hyksos dynasty had invaded Egypt and taken over before the pharaohs got their country back. You get it? Hyksos literally means foreign kings because they're not indigenous rulers. They're from the outside. They're occupiers. And so even if the term had existed, it still would have been wrong to use it for Joseph. And the Quran never made that mistake. And had the Quran been copying, plagiarizing from other books, it would have made that mistake. So where did Muhammad get this information from? One person, trying to be witty, said, well, maybe he had his own manuscript of the Bible that has never been discovered. Why would that not be a possibility? Tell me. Before we get to the next point quickly. Huh? Tell me.
He doesn't know how to read and write, so he could be what makes it.
Right. Or maybe he had like an elf in his pocket. I'm being extra silly here on purpose. So he couldn't have gotten it because the whole world knows he can't read and write. Excellent. How do we know he didn't have someone whispering this stuff into his ear? He had like a secret tutor.
You say, "Auzubillahi minash shaitanir rajim," you say.
No, as a non-Muslim, no. The non-Muslim is saying this. How do we
The
know?
language is totally different from any of those scholars of Christianity.
Yeah, like first of all, we need to know that nothing existed in Arabic for 200 years after the Prophet Muhammad in terms of scripture. You go to the greatest authorities in the academic space today and tell them when were the first copies of biblical scripture translated into Arabic, they say partial, bad translations. So they're incomplete and they're poor translations, right? Existed in like the 9th century, 9th to 10th centuries. The Prophet Muhammad existed in what century?
7.
Yeah, 6th century, right? 6th and 7th century. So 200 years, that's written. And then if you're saying, okay, maybe it was in person, someone telling him in person, well, that's just ridiculous. Because they would have to basically train him for a lifetime. How do you hide something like this, right? The world would have known Muhammad is the apprentice of this guy. He walks around with him all the time, right? The student. No one ever noticed. And let's imagine he was a ghost. And then no one ever noticed because that man is a ghost. You're only explaining where he got it from. You're forgetting the end product. That would only explain the source, not the end product. So it causes more problems than it solves to try to go these fascinating routes. Okay, preserve this promise. Compare it with any other book. I'll just defer to Anisa on this one. Is the Quran expected to be preserved? No way. Like even nowadays, you have like education and mass literacy and spell check and what's it called, Grammarly, and we still send embarrassing typos in our text messages, don't we? Right or wrong? Say, oh, I wish it was unsend. That's why we love WhatsApp, right? Because you can unsend a message after you finish cursing somebody out. Don't do that. Unsend. Yeah, you might don't curse. So the fact that the Quran can actually be preserved, and the first century manuscripts all exist and align and all this other stuff, is not to be expected. And this was a prophecy in the Quran that unlike all the other scriptures, since this is the last scripture, there will be no more clarifications, because in Islam, right, the prophets came to clarify and complete the message of the previous prophets. With this, since it's the last one, God said you're not going to be able to ruin it. It's not like the Muslims did a better job, right? It's that God, placed it in a way that it cannot be corrupted. What's even more amazing, to be honest, is that, some people try to say, yeah, but this manuscript was discovered that has this variation in it, and sometimes even Muslims come to me like as if, first of all, we discover these things, and there's nothing scary about them whatsoever. But the fact is, the Quran is not preserved on paper. The Quran is preserved in the hearts of the believers. The fact that the Prophet Muhammad, just imagine this, like he taught some people Quran, those people went and taught some people, those people went and taught some people, those people went and taught, like if we had time, I'd play telephone with you guys. I'd tell my daughter a little something in her ear. One sentence, not a book. Imagine just one sentence. By the time it gets to the last person, right? So I love you, Maymoon, is gonna get there, and Osman's gonna be like, I hate cheese fries. Right? It's crazy. And it's one sentence. So the fact that the Quran was decentralized, there wasn't like some closed door committee that keeps putting out the revised standard version. I don't mean to take a shot at people, but like, even when it's centralized, it's still problematic. The fact that there's no centralization of the Quran, everyone's teaching it for 1,500 years, and you still have the memorized versions matching up with the written versions, that's divine care. That's divine intervention here. Like, that's not to be expected at all. Like, 1/5 of the Muslims in the world are Arabs. The Quran is memorized in Arabic. 80% of them are not Arabs. Shouldn't they note it? Shouldn't they overlook the times they're mispronouncing? Right? Like, there's so many ways to cut this apple. Right? It's impossible for this to be preserved by human effort. And here's the last one. And I don't want to spend time on it because we're done. Yes?
One question on the first one. So, if we were to be asked, what's the oldest source where the oral communication has been compared to a written source? Is it what does it backdate to? 13th century or 12th century manuscript of Quran or written Quran?
No, there are in academia, you know, because carbon dating and also testing manuscripts is actually a very early thing. It hasn't been happening for long.
Isn't there one in like England that they
Yeah,
talked
yeah.
about? Early copy?
Yeah, Birmingham is one of the earliest copies. But basically, in academia, there are ongoing investigations about copies that are handwritten from the Sahaba themselves. So that would make it early 7th century. And there is agreement already in academia that first and second generation exists, right? Not compiler generation or the companions. Just one generation, like copies of the Mus'haf of Uthman are left and right established. Uthman is the one who standardized the written copy during his reign, right? And he's a direct companion of the Prophet Muhammad. Copies of the original copy, by agreement, exist. Now, how many Uthmanic copies, if any, written at the hands of the companions who lived with the Prophet Muhammad exist? That's still open investigation. And again, it's a very new enterprise and it's garnering more and more interest, alhamdulillah, of late. Any other questions? So I'm just going to give you one example about just how potent the Quran is. There are so many, of course, of how the Quran transformed lives, how Quran, was beyond any reasonable question, the inner workings that started even the European Renaissance. This was all Islamic culture grounded in the Quran, what the Quran propelled, right, of progress and advancement and otherwise. And even non-Muslim historians agree on this, and there's so many books I can refer you to about this issue. But just the Quran in and of itself, not just the positive impact and transformation it had on the world. I often tell people just consider the best-selling book in English, because like English is not, English speakers, we'd expect them to like English books, right? Or read English books more than anything else. And I've done this exercise with some of you before, some of my students here. What is the #1 best-selling book in English? The Bible, right? In the last 50 years, the Bible has sold over 4 billion copies. What is second place?
Harry Potter.
Third place.
Oh, that's third one.
You like Harry
It's
Potter?
too early. Some Chinese guys, right?
Some Chinese guy. No racial slurs in my classes, sir. Huh? Yeah. The wisdoms or the quotations of Mount Zedong. I'm saying that correctly. So that's the second best, it's a translation, but the second best sold English book in the last 50 years. Third place is
Really?
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter. Sorry, I didn't read them either. Sort of busy. And so if you add up the sales of Harry Potter and the quotations of the Chinese thinker together, combined, they don't even represent a quarter. They don't even hit 1 billion copies, like 300 million, 250 million, something like that. They don't hit 1 billion copies sold in the last 50 years. Okay? As for the Bible, it's more than 4 times as many sales. Okay? Pretty impressive. Now, take the Bible, which basically, eclipses the competition in English, and compare it with not how many people bought a copy of the Quran, but how many people memorized the Quran cover to cover by heart. Do we know 10 people on the planet, in any language, that memorize the Bible by heart? I don't think so. I don't think they exist. So, do we know 10 people in the world who memorize the entire Quran by heart? I think we might, right? How about 10 people in America? We're only 1% of the population. Do we have 10 people in America? We do. Do we have 10 people in Pennsylvania? Do we have 10 people in Allentown? How many do we have in this room? We have Hamad, sorry. We have Ryan. Who else do we have? Where's the Zains? They walked out. Well, can't flex with them now. The Zain brothers, Hamza and Mus'ab Zain, memorized the Quran, right? We easily, just in this masjid, near 10 memorizers of the Quran. Pretty staggering, right? Anyway, So this is a blessed book, uniquely blessed, even in terms of how Allah facilitated the ease of memorizing it, even among people that are not speaking its language in their day-to-day. Any questions on any of this? Again, for high level, I tried to give you like little examples of each, but don't be that person that just dumps in your doubt, right? When you're inviting someone to Islam, be emotionally intelligent, be sensitive, try to understand the person in front of you as you are sharing this message.
I have a question. You brought up a point about the Jews of Medina saying that they came to a point they realized he was a prophet, but they just said he's not our prophet. He's for them. How would you respond to someone using the same argument in today's world? Like, oh well, yeah, he might have been a prophet, or he might have been a prophet, but he's his Quran is in Arabic. He's not my people. Something along those lines.
I mean, human beings are extremely talented at believing whatever they want to believe and thinking they have justifications for it. But that's why also the whole process of da'wah, we tell you be emotionally intelligent. Why? Because the real art of da'wah, a lot of times, is about getting past people's defensiveness, helping without accusing someone of being arrogant, calling their attention to their double standard or the ego in the room, or their. Because it's also natural, like human beings, as they say in very simple terms, everyone likes to be right. Everyone likes to be liked. So sometimes when you're inviting someone to Islam, you have to factor these things in. That it's not emotionally, an option for a lot of people to rock the boat with my family and have them not like me if I become Muslim, for example. So you need to be considerate and sensitive to these things. And likewise, it is not emotionally an option for me to admit that you're right, I'm wrong, I take it back. I follow your bandwagon now, right? It feels that way. I'm not saying it is our bandwagon, this is Allah's deen, right? Because factually, it's actually very simple. Like, how do you know it's for me? Well, the Quran said it's from God. Here's the proof it's from God. God said it applies to you and it applies to everybody, right? Islam is the religion of humanity. Universalism. Like the universality of Islam is glaring in the text of Islam. And so if you believe it's from God, listen to God, right? But the layers between this and that are what cause people to not want to say it's from God to begin with. And you pray, right? You call them by day and pray for them by night. We want people to benefit from this message. We are concerned that people's lives expire before they make amends with their Maker. It's actually something that weighs heavy on our hearts as well. People will tell me, are you trying to convert me? It's like, I can't control that. But neither can you. Like, our hearts are in God's hands. But do I want you to become Muslim? Yes, I do. Islam is the most valuable thing in my life. And I want to share that with you. And I'm obligated to as well. So there's no secret about this. Yes, I want you to be Muslim. Anyway, yes, sir.
Just a small parallel point, Sheikh. The Arabic grammar or Nahu. Okay, you'll find among the Arab, the best region who are very strong with the Arabic grammar or the Nahu.
Don't say Libya.
No, are the
He's
Syrians,
Libyan.
are the Syrians and the Lebanese.
MashaAllah.
Specifically the Christians, the Christian Lebanese and the Christian Syrians are very good, are very known that they can do the Nahu translation very, very well.
Yeah.
And then among them, in order to prove their theory, they use the Quran as a parallel way to say, okay, look, poetry. And here is the translation of the Nahu. Okay? And to prove their theory, they compare it to the Quran. To make a stamp that our
Oh yeah.
الفاعل والمفعول blah blah blah
Yeah,
is correct, and here is a parallel look at the Quran because they know the Quran is a superseded statement.
Right.
It's on the top of all.
And that's what I tried to say before. There is no disagreement among experts, past or present, that the Quran is the gold standard. The only thing they're discussing is whether it's from God or not, right? But Muslim and non-Muslim experts agree that it is the top of the chain, linguistically speaking. Yeah, I felt the same thing. I mean, they were Muslims, but the Syrian students in one of our seminaries, they would always shame us with their grammar. They're very strong, mashallah. It's very impressive. Any other questions? Okay. My only complaint is you guys didn't eat the donuts yet.
I'll take a piece. After this.
جزاكم الله خير everybody. سبحان الله. السلام عليكم.